political tensions have started and ended up with early parliamentary elections and early presidential election. Then we had five-day war with Russia in 2008, followed by world financial crisis. So for the last period, and then basically transfer of powers through elections, which actually I guess we'll get back to. But my point is that despite everything that happened that prevents business development, average GDP growth was 6.5% a year. At the same time, was the job creation the same way? No. Many would argue that it was more or less jobless growth. Of course, size of the government has decreased significantly, and it was compensated by the jobs created in the private sector, and the quality have increased significantly. But to put the long story short, these reforms on the paper and in real life also gave tremendous results. But at the same time, the biggest lessons learned, I think, that we had is that we may not paid enough attention to the so-called the idea of creative destruction, which under which I mean that a lot of things have been destructed. The whole old system basically had to be reconstructed, which basically led a lot of people not have the sense of ownership in the one case. On the second case, a lot of people who were not happy with the reforms, and it was essential. And at the same time, of course, to do this kind of reforms, the very first stage was quite a big centralization of the power as a state, which again left a lot of people not very happy. And at the end of the story, yes, we did almost all the reforms that we had to do, which is so-called Washington consensus, almost all of them. The weakest part, of course, was the property rights. I think that if you ask me what was the best about the reforms, I can talk a lot. But if you ask me what was the biggest problem during this period, it was the property rights, definitely. And this is the basement of all which need to be built again and improved and so on and so on. So the major question, and then I'll stop to let the other panelists to go with ideas. The major question is it enough in terms of the reforms? Or can the reforms, or at least painful reforms, be stopped and now there's a different requirements? Or maybe now we are on the stage where we require a little bit different approach? But anyways, this is the question: what should we do next, and what is the recipe of further development, getting the country on the next stage? That's what I think is important. And here I'll stop so that, for instance.
Good evening. Thanks a lot for this wonderful conference and opportunity for me to participate in this conference with all these interesting questions and question debates which unfolded this morning onwards. Georgia is an interesting country in many respects. These 20 years or so were marked by tremendous changes, very substantial political changes, complete upheaval of the country, a couple of wars with a strong neighbor, wars inside the country, very substantial economic hardships. But strangely enough, this country, despite being very small, withstood all these challenges, especially the first economic challenges, 1998, then the second economic challenge of 2008. It seems like the country has already embarked on a successful pathway towards development. But I guess the country still faces very serious and difficult choices, and I would call these choices as two temptations. The temptation number one is that the way towards the future is far from being assured. It was mentioned in this country that we already made our choice by electing the government for the first time in 2012 freely, and subsequently we had local elections through which the country citizenship, the citizenry had the chance to express the willingness to change the government also freely. But actually it's far from being assured that democracy as a means towards prosperity of these people is already assured. And I would just like to recall one notion from economics, that the link between causal and consequential relationships between growth and democracy is always debatable, at least to some stage of development, namely when the GDP per capita reaches $10,000 per capita. The country is still far away from that. I guess we're already approaching the status of middle income country, but still some challenges lie ahead. The second temptation is that already in other panels in this morning, some countries were mentioned, like Singapore. Another country was in Central Europe. I would probably guess that this is Hungary, in which the level of economic development is far higher than in this country. But these countries, one of them, Singapore, has never been a functional democracy. Another one, strangely enough, declares the path reversing the democracy. So somebody might have the wrong illusion or temptation that democracy is not the right path for the country to develop. So these problems might be more acute given the peculiar difficulties that this country is facing right now. We know that, like my predecessor already underlined, despite very serious economic growth rates, we are not that successful in creating jobs. I would stress that job creation as such is important, but creation of formal jobs is also another problem. Namely, we have approximately 2 million people employed by the economy, but only 600,000 of these people pay taxes, out of which approximately 250,000 work for the government, which means that dependency on the state still remains to be high. So this urges another question of creation of some kind of broader based growth for economy, because the challenges ahead imply for higher quality public goods that should be delivered by the state. Attainment of marginally the same rates of growth subsequently will become more and more difficult, as the economic literature shows. So for this country, subsequently, the challenge would be to find the way between these two temptations, not to be too big for the state to enter into the areas in which state does not quite have the competitive advantages, and try to redistribute wealth as quickly as the urgency presses. And the second temptation is to maintain the right way of development and not to fall under the illusion that there is some other way than democracy to attain the prosperity of the people. I would probably stop at this stage of the game and transfer my word to the next guest.
Professor Jensen, thank you very much. Thank you, everybody, for inviting me here. I'm George Cherkadze, President of Business Association. A couple of words. The Business Association of Georgia is an organization that gathers together 70-plus largest companies, like you guys know, Fortune 500 or Fortune 100, represent about 40 to 50% of Georgian economy and more than half of the taxes with our membership, represent mostly large companies. Looking back at Georgia, and my colleagues have been talking about, all the challenges that Georgia went through. Looking from the private perspective, business perspective, one of the biggest challenges with job creation, with economical development, what I see in Georgia is that government needs to try to stay out of business. I feel as more government will understand and rely that business is the one who creates the jobs. And for business to create more jobs, it needs certainty. As more business are certain and more business realizes that it's a good opportunity to invest, they are going to do so. When President Kadagidzė was talking about Georgia, it was very interesting for me about all the GDP contraction. Now, most of you guys, especially Georgians who are here, 25 years ago, nobody from us knew what was business. We didn't know what business was. We didn't know how to make business. We didn't know what really economy was, because we were coming from Soviet times where we're not allowed to do business. So 25 years ago, Georgia started to mature to become independent state where people were allowed to start doing some type of business activities. Now we have thousands of companies and hundreds of large companies who are creating added value, who are paying taxes, so government can distribute and make decisions what to do, how to pave the roads, how to build the infrastructure. Now, when we're talking about job creation, the only way for jobs to be created are for entrepreneurs to invest more, to make Georgia as a place more competitive. So there'll be more investment coming to Georgia. There'll be more added value in country. So we can have more services. We can pay more taxes, of course, not more as percentage, but more as a volume. And then there will be more services provided. We're talking about 6.5% GDP growth that was going. I personally think that's low, and I think that there is an opportunity to have much more than that. If we look at China, if we look at other countries, we see that there have been a lot of opportunity or chances where the growth was much higher than that. Now, why it's not happening in Georgia, and how to make that it will happen in Georgia? I think that, first of all, if the businesses and if businessmen will realize that they have an opportunity to invest in the long term and they can get out the profits, that's most important for any businessman to invest in Georgia, and this is an attractive place to do so, they will do so. Now, for me, one of the surprising and I think very kind of good steps, what I've seen during a transition from the previous government to new government was the stereotype that we always had that new guys are coming in, they're taking over all the businesses, everybody's out, and new guys are in. And fortunately, that didn't happen. And I think that has been a really, really positive signal to businesses who are very, very worried 2 years ago that how this transition would happen. And during these 2 years, we see a really big positive step for the whole country and businesses and society, that we had very little political pressure, direct political pressure going to the businesses, especially large businesses, which I think is a very, very big positive step. Georgia being so young, we need to have a couple of more years for businesses to make sure that this is a country where they want to invest in long term. It's not from election period to election period. And then if it's what the message we're going to be getting from the government, and that's something that the business people are going to believe in, I think they're the ones who will be creating more jobs. The jobs are directly related to investment. Investments are related to confidence of the business people bringing our international colleagues and telling them, despite all what's going on around us, what's going on in Ukraine, going on in Russia, going on in Turkey, Armenia, Azerbaijan, we still want you as a foreigner to invest in Georgia. And that's why. And I think everybody needs to realize that as long as they give us an opportunity, as long as business are given this opportunity, Georgia is going to prosper. There will be more jobs. I personally do not believe in the long run the government can create jobs. As my colleague said, government could have some jobs for a time. They could maybe, hire more people. But generally, government is not a functional or competitive business structure. They don't understand profit and loss. They don't have a profit and loss. So the only ones who can create jobs for long term to stay in country are businesses. And businesses need to feel that that's the place where they want to invest. We also need to all realize there's a lot of other countries except Georgia where businesses can invest, including Georgians. So that's why partnership between government and private sector is so important. I personally think that we are going on the right track. I think that there are challenges on the way. There are challenges of communications, but that step, what happened during the last 2 years, I think is very, very positive. And I personally believe that all the challenges around us, all the challenges internally, as long as we have the same understanding of economical development, economy growing in Georgia, will be addressed. And I look very positively to next 3, 5, 10 years, as long as the changes that are happening in Georgia are going to go in the same way that we see it now. And what businesses in the end want? They want the government to let them do their job, create competitive environment, do not get into their business, and let them create added value. As long as there is an added value, there is more taxes. And then everybody's happy, and we have higher GDP growth. So to that part, I'll just stop and go back to Professor. Thank you.
Thank you all for your remarks. I'd like to pick up the conversation here with the question that the president of the central bank ended with, and that is what to do to get to the next level of development. George, you mentioned predictability, and undoubtedly developing a record of predictability and the peaceful democratic transition, that all is good for business. But what beyond predictability? Are there policy interventions that could actually enable Georgia to become more competitive?
Well, I'll get to the figures because I think that's the best arguments. What is the biggest problem of Georgian economy and Georgia as a structural problem? Usually when the policymakers talk about structural problems, I hate it because nobody really has a clue what he's talking about. But Georgian case is pretty much, in my view, very straightforward. There is no single case of European country reaching $10,000 GDP per capita without 75% urbanization rate. No single example. Today, urbanization rate of Georgia is 50%. Our aim is to reach $10,000 GDP per capita within the next 10 years, which means that for the next 10 years, more than 25% of the rural population have to urbanize. We are talking about approximately 250,000 people. A. B. Today we have 50% of the population living in the countryside, contributing to 8% of GDP. How this can be tackled? When we talk about the unemployment and we talk about the 2 million people of the labor force, half of them are self-employed, which means that thousands and hundreds of thousands of jobs has to be created first to turn the self-employed to the employed first in the formal sector and then go to the higher productivity. These are all the processes that when European countries have undergone, it was very painful. This is a process which China and India is undergoing right now, which is extremely, extremely painful, especially the cases of urbanization in China is a very, very big issue. So the questions that I am raising again, yes, we definitely heard the voice of the free market and the businesses which we all do respect that leave us alone. We don't want government to intervene, and definitely government should not intervene. But what is the structure we are moving to? We have a big problem of how big are our cities. To give another figure is that, as you well aware, the normal structure is when the second largest city is half of the size of the first, and the next largest city is half of the size of the second, which means that the second largest city in Georgia should be with a population of 600,000 people, approximately. And the third largest should be 300,000. And today, the second largest city, Kutaisi, is 120,000. It must be 4 times bigger. The third largest must be 3.5 times bigger. How this process of migration, how the process of getting the appropriate skill to the self-employed people there will go? is the private sector alone capable of transforming the whole structure? I think it's a big, big question. Because when we talk about the democracy and the different stakeholders involved, let's be honest here. We have almost all the examples of the growth, especially the Asian examples, the South Korea, Singapore, even the Chilean example, and many other examples. It was growth, it was different time, growth without democracy, to put it very straightforward, and then there was transformation to democracy only after reaching some point. Of course, it's not possible now. I mean, we had a very, very good example of transfer of power through elections, which we keep repeating many times, and our European friends not really sometimes, well, sometimes I understand it's a little bit boring to talk about that all the time, but if we look at the map, you don't find too many countries in this region and eastward where we have witnessed change of power through election. It's a big thing, but another question is that it's not enough. We need sustainable model with a big, big second generation reforms. I don't know. Is it possible only by the private sector? I doubt.
Very good question, Mr. President. But I agree. It's not. I think that it's not possible, and I agree with you that there is a big role of the government and in making the whole country as Georgia more competitive. And we need to have a vision. We need to have directions. We need to know where Georgia is going, how and why Georgia will attract more investment. So what you say, I mean, I agree most of what you said. That's why I think that public-private partnership, businesses working together with government and realizing what the vision is very, very important. Same time, doesn't matter what government is going to do. And we saw a lot of positives during the previous government, what they were doing. If business is worried with the changes, or if business fears that government has too many hands or too deep hands in their pockets, they are not going to invest. So you could try to change everything, you can have a very nice policies, but if investors, including domestic and international investors, do not trust or do not believe that that's the place where they're going to make money, and every businessman is investing for a purpose of making money, they're not going to invest in Georgia. Because there's so many other countries in the region and also far away that are attractive. Georgia is not the only one. So we need to find the right formula, how this is going to work. And I absolutely agree with you. I mean, businesses themselves, without having a clear vision and the help of the government of the growth or why Georgia, they will not be able also to do so. For me, personally, as a businessman, also as a president of the association, what I've seen is that this transition, what you're talking about, what we're talking about, you know, the transition of the government through the elections, has been very, very interesting and positive, because what we as Georgians remember during the last 25 years is that the government was only changing through the revolutions. So we had every president which was overthrown by the new leader and then was overthrown the next leader. And then every new guy was coming in, was bringing his own people, and things were changing. Everyone who was before was bad, and it was taking years. Now, this is only giving an opportunity for the business people or for entrepreneurs to think about the short-term investments, how they can make money in like 3, 4, 2 years, which we all know that none of the large companies in the world have been built on 2, 3, 5-year perspective. And so that's why I think everybody needs to think together about how we can create a strong private sector in Georgia, a strong sector that can invest in long term, companies that we will remember our children and grandchildren will say, wow, I know this company. This has been here 50 years or 100 years, because we all want that. All successful companies, all large companies that we know, except some completely modern or new techs, they have been there for tens, generations, some of them. So for me personally, that's why it's very important for government, public sector, understand where we are, where the business stands, and how business reacts, and how they're going to react in future based on the decisions what government is going to make. Of course, government is going to lead because government is responsible for the future of this country. That's why the government is elected, why the political parties are elected. But at the same time, we depend on them on giving us the platform of future development, investment, and then in the end, what I think a lot of times politicians especially do not realize, and I had a lot of times a challenge personally to explain to a lot of politicians that businesses are there to make profit. If you will challenge them making profit, or if somehow businesses will be scared to make profit, they're going to make profit somewhere else. And a lot of times, businessmen are treated the way that they are thugs. So the way that if they make money here, that's really bad. And that's, I think, because we're coming from Soviet times and Soviet era, where 25 years ago, making money was very bad. And so that's something, for me personally, I think the most important and critical when society, government, and private sector are talking together to realize that as long as we work together, we can achieve that. So to continue what George, you said, I agree that needs to be done, but the same infrastructure projects, urbanization is not going to happen if business is not going to be strong, will not be paying taxes. We can see what happened during the last 10 years, right, during previous government, how much taxes were collected and how much taxes are collected now. And that's, of course, because of the reforms that the government did, but at the same time, that's because the investors and business people have invested in Georgia. They put money there. Thank you.
LD, do you have reflections?
Just a couple of remarks. Oftentimes, when you take a look at the international surveys, they demonstrate that the local force oftentimes is referred to as lacking the competency necessary for modern-day jobs. One of the causes for that might be the low quality of the primary education. And I guess primary education has the key consequences subsequently for the creation of the middle class, for creation of the competent workforce, who must be the cornerstone of the future development and economic growth of the country. So it was duly so mentioned, some examples of countries like Chile, some countries like China, etc., from Southeast Asia. These are all mobilization growth examples. I guess, and this was also clarified, that unfortunately at this stage of this game, in these countries, this kind of growth is not attainable. So probably the country should invest more in quality of the future generations than it is doing now. If you take the average salary of the school teacher, it's ridiculously low, even as compared to the lowest paid jobs in the state sector. So I think that if this country wants to be successful democracy in the future, this should be changed, and dramatically so, and quickly.
So that's a specific recommendation on focusing on primary education. Mr. President, the issue that you raise about urbanization, and if you're right about that, you're definitely right about the empirical observation of urbanization and growth across Europe. What are the specific policy interventions that might be implied by your analysis of that problem?
Well, unfortunately, we also have our history, which is Soviet history. I will go back 50 years ago. During the Soviet times, Soviet leaders have also understood, and it was obvious, that having 80% of the population living in the countryside would not get the country anywhere. And they also started the urbanization policy. But it was a Soviet-style urbanization policy, directed from the center with no real clue what's going on. We have the city here called Rustavi, which is 25 kilometers from here. And this is a classical example of Soviet-style urbanization. It was nothing there at all, and there was a decision to build the big heavy factories there and the big city. And today there is a big city in the place where nothing was there. And it was, of course, organized or accommodated with a big propaganda on TVs, all the Soviet-style movies, basically Soviet-time movies. Most of them is a propaganda of urbanization. I will not name it for our Georgian friends, for our Georgian audience. I'll just name a few, is like Sabudaril Chabuki, for instance, which is a classical propaganda of urbanization, right? It's a Soviet-style propaganda of urbanization. This is the whole idea of that movie. And the growth was reached because growth was reached from totally ineffective agriculture of 80% population to also very ineffective, but more effective than what was before. And then everything stopped after the 70s, and we know what happened. In today's world, it's impossible in Georgian society to urbanize like China does. It's totally impossible, where China is doing pretty much the same, building up the cities first and then letting the people in this kind of thing. The only way in Georgia it can be possible if the private sector is strong enough, creating jobs and basically outsourcing these people. But at the same time, I of course agree with my colleague that what kind of jobs and what kind of power the private sector, even in case of creation, can outsource from the countryside. If I'm a businessman, for me it will be much more effective to get the manpower from Turkey, from other people, which is much cheaper, and much more productive and qualified way. So for the government, it's very, very important to understand that we do have unemployment, but this unemployment is, again, it's structural. We have unemployment because we have a huge portion of population who does not have the skills which modern businesses require. Yes, it's not popular to say, but that's the case. We don't have as much problem of job creation at this stage of point. Of course, this is also a problem, but the bigger problem is a mismatch of the skills. On one hand, there's a demand on the people all the time, on the qualified workforce, and on the other side, we don't have it. And we can see it in every single industry. Construction, IT, finance, everywhere, basically. Can we turn the self-employed people into the qualified workforce? How it can be done? How it can be done in a democratic society without directing, without punishing, and without doing the stuff that the Soviet era did and what other countries did. I don't know how it's possible. I think that's $1 million question, actually, how this can be achieved.
Well, let me press the $1 million question just a little bit, because it seems that LD is on to something about education, primary and secondary education. And Frank, before me, we have a rich tradition of criticizing our own country. In the US, we do a horrible job of preparing people for the workforce. So we send all sorts of people to college who are not otherwise inclined. They drop out, and they aren't prepared to do anything. And on the other hand, our vocational education has been traditionally very weak and looked down upon. And we've never gotten the right balance between four-year liberal arts education provision and vocational skills training. And I'd just like to, actually I'd like to learn a little bit from you what's happening in Georgia on this, the consideration of vocational skills and what's needed for the workforce and how public education can feed into qualified future job holders.
Well, I'll just say two remarks regarding the U.S. education and dropouts. Yeah, you have the dropouts from college, and then name of these dropouts are Bill Gates and Mark Zuckerberg. So.
They're total outliers, and Steve Jobs as well, total outliers.
No, the issue there are two things. First of all, I think it's extremely expensive to have the quality education, even on the primary education in the countryside. I think, to be realistic, I doubt that Georgia and our fiscal resources can afford to have high level of even the secondary and primary education in the countrysides. A. B. I am totally convinced that in order to succeed, we need to have very English-speaking society. I am 100% convinced that if we don't reach the same level of English-speaking population as we had with Russian-speaking population during the Soviet era, it will be very hard to integrate Georgia and to make Georgia competitive. I think if we say one part of this education as a primary part in today's global and consolidated world, I think that English must be very widely taught and spoken as a second language. I think it's very essential. And the third thing that I would say is this is all basically on the disadvantages, but on the advantages part, there's one big thing that's going on and we should take the advantage of is the development of the internet and the high tech. And the education industry now and giving the Stanford and MIT example where the whole content is on the web. So basically the modern institutions, the very high top ranked schools like Stanford, they put the whole content on the web and you have all the lectures on the web. And given you speak English, you can get the quality education from anywhere in the world through the web-based technology. I think this is a know-how that we need to take advantage of. Otherwise, I don't know how it's possible to get the quality education in a school in the countryside where you have only 50, 60 students. Your expenses per pupil will be huge. I don't know how it can be afforded in a very fragmented and geographically very splendid way. So I don't know.
LD, do you have a comment on this? Of course, that feeds very much into your urbanization story and the
yes,
need for
basically I would
urbanization.
agree with much of what was said, but actually my point is to improve the basic numerical and literacy skills of the country. And it's interesting to compare us with other similar countries. How do we compare internationally at the very basic numeracy levels with countries who do not have fundamental science but had tremendous economic success? That's my whole point. But I would largely agree with much of what was said.
I also agree with George, Georgi. Education is crucial. It's crucial for Georgia. We as a businesses struggle every day trying to find right base of motivated employees who want to stay there and also with the right skill sets. Same time, looking at around us, we see that our neighboring countries in a lot of ways are cheaper than us with skill sets that they have there. And that's surprising because a lot of times we always say that Georgia is a cheap place to get a labor, which I think is not true. Long run investment in education, and I want to completely agree also with Lasha, is a crucial for a country to succeed, to go forward with economical development, economical growth, creating a right strategy, country strategy towards education, investing more money, definitely will give us more results. But at the same time, we also need to have a clear vision, coming from the top our politicians in government, where are we going? What's our economical story of future? Is it going to be anything, or are there particular sectors that we're going to get? Like, a lot of times we hear now, and it's a very big part of in Georgia, talking about how agriculture, investment in agriculture is going to save Georgia. If you look back and look at the reports, let's say World Bank reports, now look at the countries' averages, percent of GDP of developed countries. You see that most of developed countries, percent of GDP in agriculture, let's say starting with the US, most of European countries and others, are 1, 2 to 3% of GDP. Most of undeveloped countries, GDP in agriculture is pretty high. So it's close to 10 or plus percent. So what it means that I believe that agriculture is important, but I believe that other sectors need to grow quicker than agriculture for us to want to become a modern country where GDP in agriculture will be lower, meaning that right now I think Georgia has 8%, 8 to 9% GDP in agriculture. Now, if that's supposed to grow fast and come to 2 or 3%, that means that every other sector needs to grow 2 or 3 times faster. So, and that's the same story about urbanization and other things. So that is also something that we need to have a clear vision, discussion, and kind of agree together with, you know, government, public sector, the private sector, where we're going. Because for entrepreneurs, small, medium businesses, to make a decision where they're going to invest, it's all coming from the vision, what's happening next. And I believe that agriculture, in one way, giving a big opportunities for Georgia, shows that there are other sectors that could have tremendous opportunities for Georgia if this country is going to grow. And we all know that Georgia is going to grow. The question is Georgia going to grow 4, 5, 6%, or are we going to go double digits? Are we going to go 10, 11, 12%? And how we're going to achieve that? And you know, and all the comments of my colleagues about education, I completely agree. If we do not have competitive force in Georgia to take jobs and create added value, to create competitive products that can go on world markets, we will not have a big growth. We'll have a growth probably of 4, 5, 6%. And to be able to achieve that, we need to discuss this. I mean, that's not something that private sector can do alone. I don't think that government can do that alone, because government, a lot of times, special government bureaucracy, does not understand private sector, doesn't understand how it works. So that's why I think that today's forum is so important, and what you guys are doing is excellent, because it creates a platform of us having an opportunity to discuss this with each other, with everybody who is here, and just many ask the questions that we need to all think about. Like, for me, it was very interesting, a lot of information I got today from my colleagues about things that I never realized that was happening. So we all need to think about it, and I think with Georgia, with all its benefits, with all opportunities that are here, we have so many challenges that for us to be able to go through this, we need to spend a little bit more time of developing a right vision and strategy for our country in future. And that's what I believe strongly, that it needs to be done, and it needs to be done not just for the paper, not for some document that will be somewhere sitting and will say, okay, sign off, there's a strategy. For something that we really believe that it's Georgia in 10 years, 2024, is going to be much more advanced, much more economically stronger than 2014. And for us to believe in that, we need to see where we're going. And that's why there's so many questions. That's why I also appreciate all of our panel talking about it, because we see so many challenges around us. now plus the challenges with Ukraine, with all political situations around us, and we feel it, that it's, for Georgia to be able to go through it, it's a lot of unanswered questions, unfortunately.
I'm only going to ask two more questions, and then we'll open it up to the audience. We've talked a lot today about geopolitical challenges that Georgia faces, but I'd like to turn to the geo without the political, and that is, economists are always talking about factor endowments, and one of those endowments is always geography. And I'd like you all to reflect a little bit on the geography of Georgia and the economic opportunity it presents.
Well, it's very hard to talk about Georgia without geography, because I think the whole idea of Georgia and all our advantages and disadvantages come from our geography. Yeah. And it's crucial in both ways. First of all, there are up to 80 countries in the world which are landlocked and need the access to the sea for their trade. Most of these countries are in Africa, but our region is very, very important in this sense. Two of our neighbors are landlocked, Armenia and Azerbaijan, and 5 Central Asian countries are also landlocked, including one of the richest countries, Kazakhstan, which basically brings this idea, which is not new at all, which was called the Silk Road many, many centuries ago, which brings the idea of using the Georgia as an alternative or as a one way of consolidating the trade and the goods and the flow of the goods of the oil-rich Caspian region to the Europe and to the world through Georgia. And if we can create, and now it's not only about trade, if we arrange this flow and we create that some small portion of the goods are and the values are added in Georgia, of course it's a tremendous opportunity. Of course, at the same time, this is the biggest, from the economic part, the biggest disagreement with Russia, because Georgian route is the only alternative route bypassing Russia, and not only for the oil and gas, but for everything else. For instance, there's a big project implemented several years ago. There's a fiber optic cable put under the Black Sea, connecting Georgia, Azerbaijan, going eastward, which created the only alternative way of transmitting data from Europe to China and back, the only alternative way to Rostelecom. So basically, of course, this place from the political point of view was always a place of interest for the Russia for the last 250 years, for the Ottoman Empire before, and on the east side the Persians. But today is a different world, and I believe that being the disadvantage all the time throughout the history of the geography, because we were always on the trade route, and basically all the big empires wanted the influence and control, and this was the reason for many, many wars and instabilities in the region. Today, in the 20th century, if finally we can turn this geography into the advantage, I think this will be the way to prosper and grow. And I think that the day will come, and I'm quite positive quite soon when we can do that. We can finally have the peace in the region and basically use this geography as a way of prosperity rather than the place of division of influence between the Persians and Ottomans and Persians and Russians, now the Russians and the rest of the world. So hopefully we will overcome that, and I'm sure that this day is quite close.
Just one remark actually. Black Sea is very unique among all the seas because it penetrates the the region, the continent of Eurasia to the deepest possible point, which means the transportation of goods to and from Black Sea is considerably cheaper than from elsewhere. Point number one. And point number two largely depends on the global peace, but the corridor of south-north, I guess, will also work sometime reasonably soon when there is an economic interest between these two players, big players, one from north, very unstable, and one from south, very unstable, but actually it's beneficial. It looks like beneficial to all the players. So basically we've got to be prepared for the subsequent openings.
One way I think that geography of Georgia is important, of course, as being a Georgian and, feeling that we have a sea and, we're located in a great place. But at the same time, I personally think it doesn't matter where you're located. As long as you want to change your place, you want to change and be more competitive. And Georgia's geography definitely gives us this opportunity. Now, if we look at our neighbors and look at Azerbaijan, which has a lot of oil, and a lot of times people are, we're discussing what would happen if Georgia had a lot of oil. And my personal answer would be that Georgia would not be the same place as we're now. I think that it would be much more close to the way that Azerbaijan is structured right now than Georgia. And it doesn't matter that we have sea. I mean, then probably would be more, we'll have more money richer because we'll have a direct, opportunity to transit our oil. So geography is great. We have an opportunity. We have challenging neighbors to north-south, but same time, I personally think investing in education, investing in having right vision will give us an opportunity to create a better foreign strategy, how we need to work, and what George was talking about, working with all parties, including, Turkey, Russia. We need to become a trade partners with everybody. And we know that we have challenging neighbors, but we need to be smarter, and our politicians need to be smarter to find a most beneficial outcome for Georgia, for us, for the country. We definitely have a much bigger benefits than some of our neighbors, like Armenia, which doesn't have a opportunity to go to the sea, an entrance, or just in Azerbaijan. But we need to be smart enough to use that advantages for ourselves. And the Silk Road, so-called Silk Road, which we, as a Georgians, always learned that, Georgia was a part of the big Silk Road, and that was a big thing. That is, it's very good to have stories, but another is very good to use that stories to real benefit out from it, to have real benefits. How we can utilize that, it all depends on us, it depends on country. And we realize that we challenge Russia with that, but at the same time, right policies and a right way, right approach gives you an opportunity to create a value from that. So that will be very interesting to look through. Looking at our past, we went through a very, very challenging period during the last 20 years, 25 years. I don't think that's over. Really, looking at what's happening in Ukraine, I think that's the beginning. But we need to be smart enough, the country and politicians smart enough not to get into that, big wound, what's happening right now in Ukraine. And how all our, me speaking every day with a lot of international investors, the first question that everybody asks is, how far are you guys from Ukraine? And that's challenging because everybody wants to understand: are we close? Are we there? Or are we far? And how is this affecting us? And then everybody realizes we're all in Black Sea, so that's another challenge. But hopefully that will be success. Thanks.
My final question, and I'm somewhat reluctant to ask this question because it's a question that fascinates me, but I'm not sure that all of you will be equally fascinated. It came to my mind when you were talking about problems in the next stage of development, and that is property rights. And property rights issues are difficult issues across all transitional countries. Almost by definition, you're going to have incredible property issues that arise through a transition process. And I just invite you all to comment on property rights in Georgia.
Well, first of all, I think that international investors that Kiga mentioned, it's good that they're not asking how far Georgia is from Iraq. Because Georgia is much close to Iraq than to Ukraine, so that just usually what people tend is they ask questions in the terms of how far we are from the west. But if you go down south, just 1.5 hour flight, you will get to the places much worse than Ukraine. So much worse. So especially now. Anyways, I will not tell the story. The famous story of Georgians, how they got this land. It's a big joke, but anyways. Regarding the property rights, I think it's essential. I think it's very hard to find any single person in the world who understands a little bit of the state building, of the economy, who would not say that it's the number one issue if we want our economy to develop. If we want anything to happen in this country, it's all about property rights. And not only about Georgia. I mean, going to the history, many would argue that industrial revolution in UK has happened because one of the reasons was that they had the property rights much ahead of the continental Europe. Do we have the problems in the past with that? Yes, we had. Do that problem had their own roots? Yes, definitely they had their own roots. But the major lessons learned, I think, is that no matter how the property is attained by anybody, anytime, preservation and superiority of property right is number one issue. And I think this is and I do hope, and I'm pretty much confident that this is a lesson learned for the last 10 years. And I do hope that we'll never again get back to the issue when there will be a business association or anybody else or NGOs or the media discussing that it's not protected the way it should be. On the legal base, we have everything in place. It's a constitutional amendment and everything is fine. But again, I think it's absolutely necessary. It's number one issue. Without that, to talk about the further, more complicated policies is just nonsense. That's my approach.
One issue in this regard, it was mentioned that agriculture in this country remains backwards, and it's right. But there are some fundamental reasons to it. In agriculture, we lack the flow of formal finance, we lack flow of technology, which are probably linked to absence of formal rights on property on land. Largely speaking, 80% of agricultural land in this country still remains to be registered, which, in my belief, is a fundamental constraint to development of agriculture. It might be said, and duly so, that the land parcels distributed by the state are so small that not always they are bankable, but by registration of property on land, the country can create the whole class of asset holders which are legally visible by others. If, for example, me as an outsider, if I want to purchase some land in some rural area, if I don't have the insider information, there is no way that I can obtain the information about the prices of assets. So I guess in this regard, this is one of the large chunks of problems in property rights in this country. It seems like that they are secured, but it's also clearly stated in the civil code of this country that the property is legal only after registration. So 80% of land which was distributed by the state by the time, beginning from the 1992, is not registered as of yet still. So I guess there is a problem in that regard.
I agree with my colleagues, and very important question. Property rights, important. Same time, let's look back at determination, what we believe as a fundamentals of the property rights. Georgia, being a young democracy and all the country for 25 years, we do not have a memory of the ownership of the property for more than probably 50 or 70 years. Now, when you look at US, when you look at Europe, and Asia, and other countries, we see generations, we see the families owning the properties for generations, for hundreds of years. We don't see that in Georgia. We never knew what was owned and who owned particular land or building 100 years ago. I mean, we may be heard of, but we know for sure that now it's somebody else. So memory of Georgians of the property right goes so short that we need to have a confidence. And if somebody will ask me personally that, do you believe that that particular asset that you own or your friend owns or your colleague owns, his family is going to own if they decide to keep it 100 years after now? I'd probably say, I don't know. I'm not sure. Now, if you ask probably the same question in the United States or in Europe, they will say, yes, for sure, because they can look in their past and look that, families have owned there's some things for hundreds of years. Now, that's, I think, one of the crucial things, because we're talking of property right protection for somebody that's only looking at that property for very, very short term, meaning that they could want that for a long term. They could want to have that for a long term, but our memory is so short that when we look at something, we want to believe that minimum for next year, 5 year, 10 year, that's going to be something that is not going to be taken from us by the government, by somebody else, or so on. I hope that progress that we are all now discussing and talking about is with institutions and laws being in place, we definitely will stay, and will be something that we all will recognize. But same time, personally for me, as a businessman that owns property in Georgia and owns property abroad, I could tell you that it's pretty challenging because, and it's not challenging because of the government here or because of something, because of the history of the country, because of the region, because of the former Soviet states, because of what's happening around us, that didn't give us an opportunity to go through many, many generations yet, where the generations, our children and children's children, got the properties from their families. And until that's not going to happen, we always will have a question in the back of our head and ask, so what are we talking about? Are these assets that we're going to keep? Is it something that I want for trade? Exactly the same question about the agricultural land, that I completely agree, the registration and land probably something that is more crucial for a lot of locals and Georgians to keep and hold on. And I think that is something that will probably next years will show us really the learning curve that we all need to go through, as what does it really mean to have a property as an asset that you can keep for a long term. That's why it's so probably interesting when we are talking about the country like Georgia or the new democracy, when we're going through this transition period, that there's so many questions that you will never ask in the West. You would never think about it because there it just you just do not have an examples in a 100 or a couple 200 years where this was challenged. And we're talking about here it's being challenged every election period from 4 or 5 years. So that's why it's crucial for everybody, all stakeholders to understand importance of this. And that's also why you see what's happening. Like one of the examples was funny thing, what's happening with Russia. I was looking at how the Russian government's sanitary decided to close the McDonald's there, that was open 20 years ago, I think, and that was one of the, kind of a showcase for them bringing foreign investment and foreign capitalism into Russia. What could happen in countries like this, and are we secure that it's not going to happen in Georgia in the next 5 years? If you ask me, I'll say absolutely not, because I want to believe that's going to be a case, but, we still go from the election period to election period. And I'm very happy that this changes, went through really well. But are we sure that next changes are going to go as well, with the property rights? We don't know. So until we are not going to establish democracy, it would have a generational changes, that things will go right, and it's not going to get in the blood of the people and society, it will be very hard to say 100% no, that's going to stay here.
So let's open it up to the audience and perhaps collect a couple, 3 questions. Oh, there are some hands. People have stayed awake. It's a good topic. We'll collect a few questions and then we'll have another group. So let's start here in the front. Yeah.
A very short remark and then ask a question. Remark is about the property rights. Surely you meant to qualify your remark about property right being beyond any reach of the government. No matter how it's acquired, obviously if it's acquired through illegal means, bribery, drug trade, that's a legitimate area for the government to intervene and take it away. And also it's not, it was presented, I think, in a little bit of an absolute manner, in a sense that even in the most advanced liberal democracies, property is taxed. Sometimes it's highly taxed, and very often people are forced to sell and give up their property, sell their property because they cannot keep up with the taxes or inheritance tax, for instance, and so forth. So it's not an absolute right as long as it's very well regulated. And also taxes change, so the current generation in, say, United Kingdom is not sure that next generation will not have to pay higher taxes. So it's a relative concept, I think, more or less. But what I wanted to mention, I think it's a very interesting contrast with the first panel we had in an economic sense, because the first panel, the president, Mr. President, he explicitly mentioned the need for redistributing wealth in the country. He mentioned the fact that the country has experienced tremendous economic growth, but the growth hasn't been distributed equally, and there's a big income gap, wealth gap in the country. Of course, anytime you mentioned redistribution of wealth, it sounds problematic, but certainly that doesn't really chime well with the concept of living businesses alone, because if you want to redistribute wealth, you have to interfere. Of course, in a classical economic sense, that's not the thing to do, but I think there is a growing evidence, and more experts agree that equality is actually a good thing for the economy. That it's not a dichotomous with the economic growth. And in fact, several of the concepts that were sounded here indicate precisely that. Primary education, for instance, or what has not been mentioned is a good health care in the country, for instance, that guarantees healthy workforce for the economy, for the investors. And of course, with the education, you get with a more education population, you get a higher level of investment. Technically more investment into technically more advanced areas, which is of course even better for the economy. But for that, you've mentioned that private sector cannot do it alone, meaning guaranteeing a high level of qualified workforce, good education, and public sector also cannot do it alone. But it's pretty straightforward, but that there must be money available in the budget to be invested in a clever way in the education. So I just wanted to see your opinion about what Mr. President said earlier today about the need of redistributing wealth, and maybe that being also a serious problem for Georgia's economy currently, that is the unequal distribution of wealth between the haves and have-nots. Thank you very much.
Let's collect a couple of more. Yes, right behind Irakli. Very good.
I think Stanford alumni should kind of take control of asking questions vis-a-vis the Georgian challengers. So I'm trying to do that. I'm Esther Hakopian from Armenia, and I have two questions to our panelists. You spoke about the need for jobs and the lack of jobs, and we know that this is a widespread problem, not only for Georgia, but for the neighboring country like Armenia and Azerbaijan. And we all know that job migration to the north neighbor has been one of the solutions for our two countries, I mean particularly Armenia and Azerbaijan. I was wondering how much is that the same for Georgia, and I would want to put it into political context because the previous panelists were challenged by the opposition about making stronger comments on the stance vis-a-vis Ukraine situation, and no one mentioned any economic reliance on Georgia or any presence of Georgian citizens in Ukraine, or in Russia, sorry. So I just wanted to hear from your comments to how much the Georgian economy or Georgian citizens depend on Russian economy. And my second question, I intended first to address to the president, then to the foreign minister, but because of the very intense exchange between opposition and the current government, I didn't get a chance. So I just wanted to make sure that the omission of Armenia as a partner by president was not intentional. And I would want to hope so, because later on the foreign minister made some amends to this extent, but with probably Armenia being very much dependent on Georgia, and you spoke about that a lot, and Armenian citizens, or I would say around 500,000 traveling to Batumi and Black Sea resorts, bringing a lot of revenue to Georgia. I wouldn't want to see any kind of these omissions happening in the future. Thank you.
And then a question over here.
Georgi Bakradze, National Bank of Georgia. I have a question maybe, first of all, for you, Professor Jensen. So when we're talking about democracy and growth, democracy has a huge problem being dependent on voters. And voters are quite frail, so once you want to implement reforms that are not popular, that are important in the long term but are not popular, the government runs the risk of failing the elections, losing the elections. So, and in our case, it is particularly important because we have a tendency of winning the elections by a landslide, because people want to get rid of the previous government, so they all go and to vote for the new government. So I think when we're talking about democracy and growth and how growth depends on democracy or vice versa, we should take this into account. So how the government should persuade people that the reforms it is presenting, the reforms it's implementing are actually necessary in the long run. How the government convinces people to vote for them even if the reforms are unpopular, and in our case and in case of any developing country, reforms are liable to be not very popular, to say the least. So that's my comment.
I'm going to collect just a couple of more questions and then respond to whatever you wish. Yes, please.
Thank you. Irina from Business Association of Georgia. Well, my question is also on economic development and democracy. And I think that about the correlation between democracy and economic development. And it's argued that whether there is correlation at all, and if it is it negative or positive? Well, I believe that the sustainable economic development and democracy are ultimately strongly and positively correlated. However, we see countries that achieve like miraculous growth without democracy at all. And on the other hand, there are some countries that might not function at all without democracy. So my question is to you, Mr. Professor, what create those differences? What are the factors that determine those differences country by country? General.
And Katya?
Thank you. I'm Katya Revika. I'm from Ukraine. I'm a Stanford fellow. And I'd like to ask you a very simple and straightforward question. We've heard in the previous panels from the government officials very reassuring statements about the independence of judiciary in this country. And I'd like you to help me understand whether it's really so independent, and I'd like to learn your views, how happy you are about the independence of judiciary. Thank you.
All right. So respond to what you wish.
Maybe you start with your question.
Well, you know, I wish I had a crystal ball to answer these two questions. The fact is that usually when difficult political decisions are made and you have many losers involved, as you did through the very difficult reforms that were pursued over a 9-year period and into an 11-year period, usually those parties lose, and it is one of those vexing things. But you know, to take on even a small portion of the reforms that Georgia took on would have been somewhat politically risky. But to take on as many reforms as it did, so across sectors, across civil service, across police, across so many tax, customs, there was going to be a political consequence of this. Now, one can hope, and this is not a partisan statement at all, but history is a corrective, or can be a corrective when you look back on your history and your historical memory of the development of the country. Perhaps an appreciation for some of the reforms, even though the style in which the reforms were implemented may not have been appreciated. Now, the correlation between democracy and growth, you're right that there is a fairly good record of sustainable growth among democracies. But you look at some of the most dramatic growth stories in the post-World War II era, China, 30 years of unbelievable growth. We'll see if that ends. We can speculate that maybe that's not sustainable. But there's been speculation about that for decades, and China continues to grow. The East Asian tigers, Singapore, Hong Kong, and the like, there was an authoritarian environment in which those experiments were. South Korea. And then third, India. Now, India is more problematic. I know India really well, and it's going to be a bumpy road, and part of that bumpy road is because it's a democracy, and so many voices. So there's, you know, on the correlation, you know, there's some correlation, but the causal story is really weak. What we do know, though, is that with economic growth, continued economic growth, democracies sustain themselves, and we've got really hard empirical data on that. But the correlation causation argument, when I started at the Center on Democracy Development and Rule of Law, we had this chicken and egg debate, and I finally said, you know, enough, because the evidence isn't good enough. There was a fellow who wrote a book some years ago called The Democratic Dividend, and he said, democracy definitely has a dividend for growth. You will grow faster. What he didn't include in his model was China and the East Asian tigers. He said, because they're such outliers. Well, you can't take some of the most dramatic stories of economic growth in the post-World War II era and put them, as sometimes economists do, bury them in the assumptions and the footnotes. So that's where I stand on causation and causality.
First of all, I want to use this opportunity because one of the questions was from the Ukrainian. You're from Ukraine, and I want to once again show our deepest support to your country. I think that it's a very, very beautiful, big, very nice country, and I am sure that everything will settle soon, and Ukraine will prosper in a way it deserves. And I think that what Ukrainian people are demonstrating throughout this period is just a big example for everybody else, and especially for us. And again, once again, I think I will not be unique to say that I'm expressing maybe 100% opinion of the population about the support of Ukraine as our big friend country and a very, very nice country. Regarding your question about the independence of the judiciary, So the good thing is that tomorrow you will have the Minister of Justice here and the opposition leader Giga Bulgaria on the panel. And if you think that today was a tense day, I have the reserves for tomorrow. So you'll have a big issues, and there's a panel on Ukraine and on this issue especially. So I'll just tell you that not to be disappointed about if you don't get the answer, and especially from me, from the governor of central bank, another constitutionally mandated independent body, because it's very political anyways. So regarding the another remark, I am sure that the President Margvelashvili, if there was, unfortunately I was not present, but if there was anything regarding the comment regarding Armenia, another our big friend country, I think it's a totally misunderstanding. I'm 100% sure. And if there was anything that could have been understood in a wrong way, I may say sorry for him, but at the same time to somehow to balance your being kind of disappointed or whatever, this voice in your head. The voice that I understood. I just can tell you that when you walk when you walk to Tbilisi, every single old building, 90% of the buildings which you will like, which is beautiful and old, either are built by Armenians or were owned by Armenians in this city, which are the biggest and the richest population of Tbilisi, especially in the beginning of 19th and 20th century. So I think that in terms of the relationship with Armenia, I'm sure that we don't have any problems, and we never had any problems, and I hope that we'll not have any problems in the future. Regarding the dependence on Russia, as I told you, Georgia was totally dependent on Russia before 2006. Russia was the largest trade partner, constituting 45% of the trade. We were fully dependent energy-wise on Russia. We were buying the gas from Russia, and majority of our population went to Russia in early 90s, just like with Armenia and Azerbaijan and other Soviet countries. Why? Because when all this happened, the contraction of Georgian economy happened in early 90s. The easiest place to go for the socially active people were Russia, because there was no language barrier, no cultural barriers. There was old links inherited from the Soviet Union. So very unfortunately, actually, extremely unfortunately, the most socially active population went to Russia, which basically left. We lost I would say the golden, the most entrepreneurial, that's what Giga was saying, the people who had the highest skills of entrepreneurship and so on and so on. After the 2006, a full stop with the gas supply, full embargo in one day in 2006. That year, IMF, and here's the representative of IMF, I can see him. IMF was forecasting that our GDP would have the contraction of double digit. Unfortunately, that was not the case. Eventually, we scored very well in 2006 and 2007, especially we had the highest growth number. As of today, the only dependence that Georgia has towards the Russian economy is remittances. As the figure in remittances is following. It's not as big as in case of Armenia. Our total remittances is 8% of GDP, and out of this 8%, 40% is from Russia. But at one stage, Russia had the idea of closing that after the 2008 5-day war. There was an attempt to close, somehow to prevent that to happen, and it was impossible to do given the today's very sophisticated, complicated financial system. And plus, most of the people who are in Russia, these are all the people already becoming the part of their society, because all those who had the part-time jobs, as you remember, have been sent out, deported afterwards. So basically, when there is a question how much we depend, we don't depend, fortunately, at all, economic-wise, at all. Of course, we benefit now, especially for the last 2-3 years, with tourism, from Russia, as from Armenia and other places. But again, the portion is not big at all. So that's my remark regarding the Russian part. On the Ukraine, I don't want to omit something. And regarding the democracy, yeah, I mean.
Yes.
What can we say? Please.
One small remark on redistributive policies, budgetary policies. We already mentioned that there are probably 600,000 formal jobs in this country, whereas the population is 4-something million. So it's physically, I don't think it's possible physically to maintain sustainable, more redistributive policies that are being maintained now. So subsequently in the future, probably the task of the civil society should be to maintain the government within the limits, actually, not to go beyond what is physically attainable. I think so.
Two questions I want to address. One, property rights again. And I completely agree about Western countries' approach that to control the properties, you tax them. And yes, some who cannot pay taxes, and you were asking about inheritance tax, they sell the property. So yes, property is not forever. So there are some rules and laws how you can keep your property. But that is known, and that has been known for years. We understand that taxes can go higher, they can go lower. And I will personally agree to believe that that's the only laws and rules that could be applied to property. Now, when you're talking about revolutions, or you're talking about confiscating properties, when you're talking about redistributing property because somebody thinks, it doesn't matter who is that somebody, that the property that is owned is not owned right, that's where you have investors, especially international investors, who do not understand how to work that way. Or if they do understand, it's a gamble. It's more going to like casino or playing on a stock exchange. So what they're going to be looking for in that case is very high returns on their investment. Whenever you have a high risk, you want a high return. So somebody buying a property where they think maybe, they will look for much higher returns. But everything else, that's the way to go. You know, that's the way for Georgia to go. You know, and we have taxes. We all pay taxes. You know, and then government is there to make a decisions how much taxes we do need to pay for our property. And same time, I want to talk about redistribution of wealth. And unfortunately, I didn't hear what our president said, but we hear in every country, you hear in the United States, you know, President Obama or others talking, European leaders talking about redistribution of wealth. Now, what they are talking about, what I always feel, is not redistribution of wealth of taking a wealth from somebody and giving it to somebody else. They're talking about having a right tax burdens, so state can take that taxes and invest into education, for example, or invest into infrastructure, for example. So everybody has an access, or to healthcare, right? So that is, for me, absolutely normal. And that's the normal way of redistributing the wealth. Now, what is something that I will never agree is for somebody, doesn't matter who he is, making a decision that somebody who has a wealth, he doesn't deserve it. And he needs to give this wealth to somebody else. Or there is somebody outside who knows and who's smarter and can make a decision how to redistribute that wealth. And if Georgia wants to go in a democratic way, in a way where the property is protected, property owners need to see that they can invest in the country. They know that whatever investment they made, and we know that in Georgia, during the last 10 years, we had a lot of guys, foreigners in Georgia, who invested in real estate. We know a lot of people have started owning flats and apartments and buildings and land from the perspective that, oh, my children will be wealthy because I'll buy something cheap and they can sell it for more 10, 15, 50 years later. Now, these guys need to believe that they would be able to sell it or their kids will be able to sell it. If they feel that that will be challenged and somebody could decide that, oh, you know what, this guy owns too much flats in Vake, and that's not right. So we need to make a law that you cannot own more than 1 or 2 flats in Vake. These type of people will start immediately selling assets and taking money out of country. And that's example what you see in Russia. What you see in Russia is money coming out of the economy. Russian economy is huge percent oil-based and automatically going outside to Swiss accounts, right? That's what we haven't seen in Georgia till now. But that's the tipping point where you ask Georgia, most of Georgians and internal and foreign investors in Georgia have been retaining their profits and reinvesting in country, which is a great for a country like Georgia. It's a very small tipping point for these people to start taking this money out, taking it abroad. And you cannot stop it. Just Mr. President here at National Bank, he cannot stop it. You always find a way, and Russians find a way with our bureaucracy, how you take money out. So that's the thing for me when I think that I understand what President Powell was talking about, and I agree that if there's more investment, public investment, especially into education, and there more of the people, and more of society has an access to education, opportunities to learn, that's great, but that cannot be addressed from perspective of somebody else, including each of us sitting here. Thank you.
Just a footnote on what George just mentioned about, I think sometimes the term redistribution is used when politicians are trying to express a concern about income inequality. And income inequality is becoming an increasing political problem in the West. And I urge you all to read Thomas Piketty. He's a French economist, just wrote a wonderful book that's been translated into English that's quite good, Capitalism in the 21st Century, because it is about this growing income inequality, and politically managing this is a challenge for economies around the world. I'm looking at the title of the conference, and Charles Tilley once said that wars make states and states make wars. I feel like I've been through the War and Peace of Georgia today, and it's been a fascinating, fascinating day. And Georgia has been made and made even more through today's discussions. But I want to thank each of our panelists today. It was an outstanding panel, and I thank you all for your comments.